Transmission start. Welcome to Where Did the Road Go? Join us as we wander off the path and explore lost history, consciousness, the paranormal, unexplained mysteries, alternative thought, and much more. We are present on the web at wheredidtheroadgo.com. Now here is your host, Soraya.
Greetings and welcome to this edition of Where Did the Road Go? Tonight I'm going to be talking with Wren Collier, and Wren runs a site called Liminal Room, the Liminal Room, but you can find it at liminalroom.com, and I've been meaning to have him on for quite some time. He has some really interesting views on some of this stuff. I'm going to read the quick about off of the Liminal Room page. It says, Wren Collier is an avid scholar of the paranormal, having been obsessed from an early age with the anomalous and the occult. Originally from the American South, he currently lives in Minneapolis, Minnesota, and is currently working on a book about monsters. He does a lot more than that, too. His blog is pretty interesting, well worth checking out, although it hasn't been updated in a few months, but we all know how that goes. This is a really interesting conversation. It goes all over the place. I hope you enjoy it. He's going to be joining us for future roundtables as well. And let's see, anything else to let you know that's coming up? We got... I'm going to have some new shows with Steph Young off her podcast, and she will be coming back on. I've been getting this question a lot. She'll be coming back on to do an actual interview sometime in the next month or so. And let's see, there are shirts. There are shirts on the website. If you go to wheredidtheroadgo.com, you can click on store. And Jeff Ritzman's Men in Black car design is up there on shirts, and I'm going to be putting Timothy Renner's designs up there fairly soon as well. And, of course, if you want to help out, you can become a patron. And, again, just go to wheredidtheroadgo.com and click on the patron link. All right, that's all from me in this forward. Here's my talk with Wren. All right, welcome to the show, Wren.
Hello.
And this is your first time on here. I've been wanting to have you on for a while. You do a blog called The Liminal Room.
Mm-hmm.
And how long have you been doing that?
Probably less than a year. I don't write there as much as I should, but it's been a space for me to sort of put down ideas about various topics when I have them. A lot of my ideas, unfortunately, end up on my Twitter feed instead of going into my blog, which is something I need to rectify. But I've got a couple articles in there that kind of go about my own experiences with the paranormal and sort of my ideas about various things.
And you're interested in like the whole wealth of Forteana, basically.
Yeah, there really isn't anything in the realm that I'm not interested in. I tend to approach things both from a materialist point of view and a sort of a magical point of view, because I believe that it's worth examining every side of a topic.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm interested in cryptids. I'm interested in UFOs. I'm interested in magic. Anything really, psychic phenomena. There isn't anything that I don't want to know.
Okay, all right. Do you have all the answers yet?
I'm working on it.
So let's talk about some of your own experiences first.
Okay.
What kind of stuff have you experienced?
So one thing I talk about, I've had one UFO experience.
Mm-hmm.
It seems kind of silly when I talk about it because it was very uneventful. Nothing really dramatic happened. The basic setup was that when I was in high school, one of the places people would hang out a lot would be the band practice field. And one night, I went to this band practice field with my then girlfriend and one of my friends and his girlfriend. The girls kind of went off on their own. And me and the guy walked out into the field, and we were looking at the moon, which was full. And I noticed that under the moon, there was a tiny little light, just a pinpoint of light, a little brighter than a star. And it was doing little figure eights and weird movements. And almost like if it was like a little fly, and the moon was like a street lamp. And I pointed it out to him and asked him if he could see that. And he said, yeah. And we were kind of curious about what it was. And at the time, I came up with this justification that uh, it was a star whose light was being bent by the gravitational force of the moon. I was
Hmm.
very into physics at the time, so I thought that was a great explanation, and everything was cool. We met up with the girls, we left, and it wasn't until a few weeks later that I was like, "Wait, that idea makes no sense at all." Like, there's no way that was what that was. Um, and I mean, I don't know. I don't know what it was. It was just a small little light moving strangely under the moon. I couldn't really gauge how far away it was or anything, or tell any really detail, and it was a small light.
But it's I can't think of anything that would make that movement that's a part of our culture, I guess you could say.
Yeah, I mean, today maybe a drone far enough away could do something like what I saw. But this was in the very early 2000s, so
And why
uh,
why would a drone do figure eights into the moon anyway? I mean, that would seem like a major malfunction more than anything else.
yeah, exactly. I mean, it was kind of late at night, and this is in a fairly small town in Alabama. So I mean, who knows? I mean, I don't think it was a drone, but I also, it's odd because I've never heard anyone else describe anything else that was similar to that. When I hear people talk about the falling leaf motion of
Hmm.
UFOs,
Hmm.
it sort of reminds me of that. Yeah. So when I hear people talk about the falling leaf motion of a UFO, um, that's that reminds me of what I saw in a way. Sort of this lazy drifting, tiny little close figure eights and circles. But that's the closest I've ever heard anyone describe anything to like what I saw.
Hmm. Okay. Now you've also had like out of body experiences and stuff.
I have both me and my little brother have had pretty frequent out of body experiences ever since we were kids. Um, he actually has them a lot more frequently than I do. He was just telling me on the phone last night that he had one that lasted about 2 hours, or seemed to have lasted about 2 hours. Um, when I was really young, I read Robert Bruce's Astral Dynamics and some of Robert Monroe's books, and I sort of trained myself to have out of body experiences, although I've never been very good at inducing them reliably. Um, I've had a couple of successes, but most of the time, my out of body experiences have been um, involuntary. I'll usually either I'll start having sleep paralysis while I'm going to sleep, and then I'll transition into an out of body experience, or I will wake up in the middle of the night and have an out of body experience.
Hmm.
When I was very young and I started having sleep paralysis, at the time I was very into like the X Files and sightings and unsolved mysteries, and I thought for sure that I was being abducted by aliens.
Right, right. Well, how do you know you weren't?
Well, that's sort of the stickler. I was just talking with someone about that yesterday, and it's something that Mike Clelland mentioned as well, that the alien abduction experience might take place entirely within the realm of the out of body experience.
Yeah.
Um, I know something Strieber mentioned in Transformation. He describes having out of body experiences that were extremely similar to my own. Um, and, I think that people, when they have these abduction experiences, I know you'll see people every now and then talk about setting up cameras or doing various things to capture what's going on. And, invariably they never find anything
Right.
because I don't believe it's taking place in a physical sense.
It does leave physical marks occasionally.
Yeah, that's there's always the catch, right? Like that, who knows where that's coming from? I
Yeah.
mean, I do believe that people have implants, but I'm also, I guess, not satisfied that they aren't somehow created psychosomatically. I know I've heard that explanation,
Mhm. Mhm.
but that also doesn't fit every case either. Because I know when Strieber talks about his implant, I believe in his ear. Um, I mean, and how it like moves around and stuff. Like, I mean, who knows what that is?
Yeah. Yeah, like they tried to remove it and it moved and it started burning as it was moving, which I would think it
Mhm,
would.
mhm. Yeah. So, I mean, I know there's been some various talks with people and discussions that I've heard where people sort of draw comparisons to shamanic experiences and the out of body experience.
Right.
And perhaps like the implant thing is sort of a also tied into shamanic experiences, but I don't know enough quite about that to speak with authority about it. But I think it's worth investigating that aspect, like the out of body experience as it relates to the alien abduction experience. Now, in my experience, I've seen entities while in out of body experiences, not what people, see sort of in alien abductions. I've never seen like a gray alien or anything. I've seen shadows, sort of quadrupedal creatures sort of lurking around. Um, and I don't know what those are necessarily. I've got ideas that from sort of reading Robert Monroe's works and other people that these are sort of, I don't know, disembodied intelligences or lurkers on the threshold is a term that I talked to Aaron David about. It reminds me a lot of what Al Bender saw when he had his out of body experience that sort of spawned the whole Men in Black phenomena.
Right. Right. Yeah, I remember that conversation. That was really interesting.
Yeah, and in the documentary The Nightmare, where all these people are talking about having out of body experiences during sleep paralysis, they also describe encountering these, shadowy figures, these shadowy men who try to force them back into their body.
Yeah.
And I've had similar experiences, but I've always sort of ignored them because, at least in my mind, they're either manifestations of my own anxiety or my own hangups, or they're actual other intelligences that are trying to keep me from doing whatever I'm doing, and I kind of just tell them to go away. I don't have time for this. I know
Right.
what I'm doing.
Well, that's it. Is it a challenge? Is it something they're trying to see if you're worthy of doing this?
I don't know. I mean, I've thought about that. In some ways, it does feel a bit like a challenge. Like uh, Grant Morrison talked about when he had one of his sort of out of body experiences. He was confronted by this like lion-headed entity that told him, to get back in your body, and you have to sort of tell them to screw off,
Hmm.
and because they're in a way testing you, um, trying to keep you from doing whatever you're doing. I mean, in the nightmare, that one guy who encountered sort of this three shadowy figures and a guy like a hat man type figure, they told him to get back in his body, and he listened to them and got back in his body and woke up. Everything was normal. And in sort of the same vein, the entities that Albert Bender saw told him basically the same thing, like stop researching UFOs, like get back in your body, like drop all this nonsense. And it scared him bad enough that that's literally what he did, and he was never involved with the topic again.
So let's talk a little about Albert Bender, because I didn't know that. I just, I heard the general story of him having the Men in Black encounter, but
Mhm.
that was publicized by someone else.
Yeah, so Gray Barker wrote a book that I believe is called "They Knew Too Much About UFOs," that was based on conversations that he had with Bender. The thing Barker did was he removed all of the fantastical elements of Bender's story and replaced them with sort of material, physical elements, like these actual physical men show up and tell Bender to stop researching UFOs. When in reality, Bender later told his story in a book called, uh, I believe, the UFOs and the Three Men,
Hmm.
where he described what he really experienced. And that was that after doing this sort of telepathic ritual to contact the spacemen, he has a literal out of body experience in which he's confronted by these three shadowy figures, not men in black, not government agents, but like three shadow men who tell him that they're the spacemen and that he has to stop researching UFOs and that, to get out of this topic. And over the next few days, he encounters them multiple times, like he encounters them in a movie theater. He sees them lurking in alleyways as he goes home. And when he gets home, um, he finds that all of his papers and stuff have been rifled through. Um, and he sees this like strange glowing blue light that flashes, and he smells sulfur. There's all these like weird occult supernatural elements that were actually in play that were sort of pushed aside by Barker when he wrote his book. And most people are familiar with the meme of the sort of government agents that Barker sort of created.
Hmm.
Um, I think it's interesting that people from that point on start experiencing the Men in Black in the fashion that Barker described them, whereas in some manner that was entirely a creation of Barker and had nothing to do with what Bender actually encountered.
So that is the first Men in Black encounter?
Well, the first modern, I guess, the way we think about the Men in Black today, I think that the actual Men in Black experience probably goes back into antiquity and it kind of experiences. I know Keel talks about this in the Mothman Prophecy, sort of, the story when the devil comes to your door and asks you for something. Sort of, I think the whole, I'm sure Josh Cutchin too would probably have some good fairy stories that are
Right.
similar.
Right.
But the sort of our modern interpretation of the Men in Black phenomena started around when Barker wrote his book, and there were other people that had similar encounters. Keel describes meeting these odd Men in Black in Point Pleasant during the events of the Mothman Prophecies, and
Right.
so and there could have been actual government agents that were involved with it. I feel like you can probably separate the phenomena into sort of more supernatural bucket and a more material bucket. Um, because we know that, Air Force, OSI, and other agencies had an interest in sort of UFO communities, and for the large reason that they were scared that by investigating, these top secret aircraft, they were accidentally leaking information to the Ruskies,
Right.
and they wanted to keep tabs on people. But, on the other hand, you have these experiences like Bender who, are completely on the supernatural side of the spectrum.
Hmm. Now, what was he trying to do? He had a whole thing he was doing when this happened.
Yeah, so Bender had like a UFO sort of mailing list, like a newsletter.
Hmm.
It was actually one of the first UFO newsletters. And he wanted to, this is sort of during the age of the contactee. So we still had sort of this idea of like the Space Brothers, and like they may just land on the White House lawn, and they're going to make life on Earth so much better. They're going to bring world peace and that sort of thing. Sort of the day the Earth stood still idea of
Right.
things. And Bender wanted to encourage the members of his newsletter to telepathically contact the spacemen on a certain time and day. Um, and he like wrote out a whole script that they were supposed to basically like read off in their mind to contact the spacemen. And the interesting thing is that when you read the wording of that message, it sounds awfully lot like a Solomonic like ritual to contact a spirit. The wording isn't exactly the same, but it's close enough to raise eyebrows if you're familiar with sort of ceremonial magic.
Hmm.
And
Do you think that was intentional?
I think it was intentional. Bender was 100% a dabbler in the occult. I know I've heard Greg and some other people mention that in one picture you can clearly see what looks to be like an altar
Hmm.
in one of his photos. But I think he was mostly just like kind of a dabbler. I think he read some books. He liked spooky things. He had this like spooky attic in his parents' house that he lived in where he had like skeletons and bats and stuff. He was very much like a Hot Topic kind of guy. He would have loved Hot Topic.
Hmm.
Um, he, I feel like he probably had read books like the Goetia,
Right.
um, or had read some Crowley or different things, and felt like maybe it was subconscious influence in the way he worded his telepathic message to the spacemen, but it was certainly there. And I don't know if other people of his newsletter did sort of this ritual with him. I think they sort of laughed it off. They thought it was kind of woo.
Hmm.
But he certainly did, and he certainly got results because that night he has this out of body experience in his encounter with the three shadowy men.
Hmm. The Yeah, that's really interesting because I mean that's so different from the story you normally hear, the Gray Barker version of it.
Hmm.
Um, Something else just popped into my head about that, and I've already forgotten what it was. Um,
Well, if you ever listen to Alan Greenfield talk about Barker, I think Barker's like a fascinating character in sort of the early history of ufology. Um, he seems sort of disingenuous about certain things, like what he really believes in. He's a queer author, sort of in the South at that time where it's not something that he can be open about. Um, he sort of refers to his books about ufology as sort of like his way to make money. He sort
mm,
of sees a lot of ufologists as like suckers or
right.
marks. He's got almost like a kind of a carny sort of attitude to the whole thing. But then he writes books like The Silver Bridge, which I feel are a lot more human and emotional than books like Keel's The Mothman Prophecy. So he obviously cares about it in some degree. And there's all these cool stories like you're familiar in the Mothman Prophecies where uh, Keel talks about having conversations on the phone with Mr. A. Paul,
Right.
right?
Yes.
So if you believe Alan Greenfield, some of those calls were Gray Barker getting trashed and
Yeah.
calling up Keel
Yeah.
and
I've
just
heard
yanking
that.
his chain. Yeah, I love that. Like, I wish somebody would write a book about Gray Barker. I think he's a fascinating figure.
Hmm. Okay. Um, Now you're trying to do something very much like what Gray Barker did. Am I wrong?
Well, I really would like to explore the intersection of the occult and ufology a lot more. It's something that a lot of people tiptoe around. I know I've heard on Where Did the Road Go several times people during roundtables suggest that some experiments be done and people try to contact, UFO occupants or UFOs sort of using the trappings of Western magic.
Right.
And I think that's a great idea. As someone who is an operant magician, like I think that's a fantastic idea, and it's something that I'd like to explore. I'd really like to actually try to recreate Bender's experiment and have a group of people do his telepathic contact with the spaceman and just see what happens. Maybe nothing happens, but maybe something would happen. Who knows?
Yeah. Well, we don't know until we try.
Exactly, and it's something that the whole sort of contact with extra human intelligences is something that fascinates me to no end.
Hmm.
Um,
Hmm.
like something. Are you familiar with James Merrill's um, book of poetry, "The Changing Light at Sandover"?
No.
Okay, so that book, I feel like, is something that not many people in Forteana or ufology are familiar with, but it is one of the most significant works of channeled information that I think I've ever come across.
Hmm.
Um, it's basically James Merrill was a poet who, with his partner and a group of people, over the course of several years, used a Ouija board to talk with a number of entities, and he wrote a whole book of poetry based on those conversations.
Huh.
Now, it's interesting because he's really famous in sort of the literary world. A lot of people know about the book and have read it, but those people aren't really UFO people or not really paranormal people. The same could be said the other way around. Um, a lot of people are familiar with a lot of paranormal works, but aren't necessarily familiar with the Changing Light of Sandover. Now, being sort of in both worlds, because my partner is she's a fiction writer, and so she's involved in literary stuff. I got introduced to the Changing Light of Sandover and read it. And when I was reading it, I started thinking, like, my God, there's connections in here to all sorts of work that I was familiar with, like Robert Monroe's work, Terence McKenna's work, even work by like Gordon White and Starships, um, corresponds with things that channeled entities were telling James Merrill in this book of poetry. Uh, like things like he asks the entities that he's talking to about UFOs
Hmm.
at one point, and they describe they tell them that they don't know what UFOs are. They said that they seem to be naturally generated by the planet. There's some sort of life that is indigenous to Earth that appear to be a living packet of information transfer.
Hmm.
And like that is like one of the most evocative descriptions of a UFO that I've ever heard. You
I,
know,
I know in the I think it's in Seth Speaks, someone asked him about UFOs, and he doesn't talk a lot about UFOs, but he says something about how they are consciousness from somewhere else, and that
exactly. Yeah,
they're not ships, they're consciousness, and he's kind of surprised we can see them at all.
yeah. And that's sort of how the entities in James Merrill's work describe them. You know, they sort of talk about it. You know, they're not physical ships. They're sort of these living thought forms that contain information.
Hmm.
And you know, I think about the things that what's his name? Blanked out. The guy who did After the Martian Apocalypse, Mac Tony.
Oh, McTony's, yeah.
Yeah, like things Mac Tony said about sort of these things living in a realm of pure information. And then I think about things that like Terrence McKenna and Carl Jung said about UFOs and how that corresponds with sort of what these channeled entities were telling James Merrill. And then he talks at one point he asked the entity start telling him about the history of the earth and how the earth is sort of a greenhouse as they describe it that regulates the flow of human souls.
Hmm.
And that like instantly I think about Whitley Strieber talking about how he believes the visitors have to do with sort of the regulation and flow of human souls into and out of earth. And I think about the works of Robert Monroe because in Far Journeys and in Journeys Out of the Body, he talks a lot about seeing what he calls the M band, which is sort of this ring of energy around Earth that is made up of, what he describes as human souls that sort of flow in and out constantly. People being dying and then being reincarnated, and then that corresponds with sort of fairy lore as well. Um,
Yeah.
with I remember I read something that Josh had posted on Twitter yesterday about how um, somebody had asked Evan Wentz about the good folk, and they had told him that the good folk were sort of all around us. They're people who've been killed in war and murdered, and that they exist, all around you, but slightly out of phase.
Hmm.
And that corresponds with what Robert Monroe talks about when he goes when he's in his sort of having his out of body experiences, and he's in sort of the lower reaches of the M band, as he describes it, where it's filled with people who have recently died and don't understand that they're dead, and who constantly sort of act out things they did in life or try to do things that uh, they would do while they were still alive, or just simply wander around sort of convinced that they're in a nightmare and they're just going to wake up.
Hmm. Well, that's interesting. Yeah, I've slowly come to thinking more of like the after death state as maybe varying from person to person.
Yeah, that's how Monroe describes it a bit. The way he describes it, sort of your desires and your outlook and sort of the way you live your life. It's very kind of karmic. I don't know. It reminds me a lot of like Buddhism or something. That kind of determines what you do when you're in your afterlife. Like some people sort of just get stuck here, and like you said, act out what they did in life, or
Yeah,
think that
yeah.
they're just in a dream and then they're going to wake up. And some people sort of don't necessarily reincarnate, but go to sort of one of the middle reaches of what he says is the M band, where there are sort of like these schools, or sort of a close analogy to what we think of as sort of like a Christian afterlife, like these sort of places, like a dreamland in which these people uh, kind of stick around in and stay around in instead of incarnating again.
Hmm.
While some people just reincarnate and go
Right.
again.
Yeah, yeah. I definitely don't think that. I think there's not just one thing that happens, but I also think that we're made up of different parts coming together to be here. So like some of the
Mhm.
parts don't stick around, and some of them do, depending on what. I'm not sure really how it's broken up. But, you look at the different parts of the soul that the Egyptians, broke everything into, and I think there's a part that is uniquely here, that only exists when you're incarnated here, and that part probably dissipates when you die.
Hmm. Well, I mean, I think your memories, like that you build in your life, probably disappear
Maybe,
because
because the thing is, you have kids who remember past lives.
see, I've got a theory about that because
Okay.
I sort of take a kind of a combination materialist look at this because I believe that there are some aspects of the human condition that are purely physical. Like I'm not sure. I'm not a neuroscientist, but it's my kind of feeling that memory is probably a physical phenomena, at least in the way we think about memory. Day to day kind of like personality and memory. Because you can damage someone's brain and they can lose memories.
Right,
Things like
right.
interrograde amnesia are totally real. We know this. Um, so, but I do think that people can have experiences of past incarnations or future incarnations through sort of the same mechanisms that remote viewing and other things work. I think it has to do with quantumly entangled particles that are part of yourself. Um, because quantum entanglement works not only across vast distances, I mean, theoretically, an infinite distance,
Hmm.
but also they work across time. Um, I know this is something that I talked to you a little bit about in our email, but um, I believe that sort of a past life memory isn't necessarily a memory in this sort of material sense, but rather a sort of precognitive or postcognitive event. Like you're sort of psychically interpreting something that happened to a past incarnation of yourself.
Okay. All right. Well, that's certainly possible.
Yeah, I mean you know it's kind of an out there idea, but I get the feeling I've never had a past life experience, and maybe my views on this would change if I had one. Um, but I get the impression when people talk about past life experiences, there's a sort of disassociation with the past life and their current existence. Like it's like they're looking at someone else's life. And I also kind of wonder in some cases if you're not actually viewing one of your own past incarnations, but you're just remote viewing a different place in time that has some sort of connection with you. That could be a previous incarnation, but it could also be some other sort of causal connection.
That's entirely possible. Entirely possible. But I also think that memory is not stored directly in the brain. I mean, we've never been able to quite figure that out. Like it doesn't
Yeah.
seem to work. And when you talk about like when a part of the brain is damaged, it doesn't work. But if you look at like the brain as like if you use it as an analogy, like the brain or the body is like the car you're
Mhm.
driving. If you damage part of the car, it's not going to go, but you in the driver's seat are still fully functional.
Exactly. Yeah. And I'll concede that we don't purely understand how memory works or understand how memory is stored in the brain. I think it's a like I really enjoyed your show about sort of the brain not being equivalent to a computer because
Hmm.
you're totally right. A lot of those analogies don't work when it comes. You can't compare a binary system like a modern computer to a system like the brain, where things like memory and cognition are distributed amongst the entire sort of apparatus. And I believe that sort of I like the idea. I think Terence McKenna talked about this about how the brain is sort of uh, less like your computer and more like your radio.
Yeah.
It's like your transceiver. It's a way for whatever part of you exists outside of your body, outside of your physical self, to interpret and interact with the world. The physical three-dimensional world.
Yeah. I think I guess you can't say we absolutely need it to interact here, but we sort of do. I mean, there could be disincarnate entities, but they're not reacting the same way to matter that we do. Um,
Mhm. Yeah, that's something interesting when bringing it back a little bit to out of body experiences. Um, One interesting thing when you start having a lot of out of body experiences is when you finally give up the illusion that you have a body anymore. Like, have you ever seen the movie The Matrix?
Well, yes.
So you know the scene where Morpheus asks Neo, like, "Are you sure that's air you're breathing?"
Right.
You know, like when you sort of realize when you're in an out of body state, like you don't have to breathe, like you don't have hands, you know, you don't have a physical form anymore. Like you can do things that you're not limited to in your physical body, and sort of, I feel like your physical body is a great interface for you to interact with the world around you. Sort of the three dimensions that you exist in. But once you get beyond that, um, sort of the rules don't apply anymore. And that's something I was talking to Aaron a bit about sort of discarnate entities, about kind of extra human intelligences.
Hmm.
In that we have to be careful about uh, anthropomorphizing them,
Yes.
because they don't necessarily even experience reality like we do,
Right.
because they're not necessarily even sort of like what we would even think of as like three-dimensional. They may exist, they may not see time or experience time in the same way that we experience it. um, and there's no way that we can confirm or even really have any reference point for that.
And when you look at a lot of UFO experiences and things like that, they seem to be operating from a point outside of time. Like they know
Hmm.
things they shouldn't know unless they were looking at it from a slightly different perspective. And it seems boggling to us, like the way they did it in the Mothman Prophecies movie where he's holding the chapstick
Hmm.
and it knows there's chapstick in his hand. But that's not so far off from some of the stuff that actually did happen where they would know things they couldn't possibly have any reason to know.
Yeah, unless they were outside of what we think of as time.
Right.
I mean, the reason we experience time the way we do is because of a thing called the thermodynamic arrow of time. I know it's something I've heard Micah talk about.
Right.
The basic idea is that entropy, the process of entropy, creates what we experience as linear time. Um, I believe that as a species, as animals, we experience time in that way because we have to constantly fight against entropy. We have to take in energy through eating and things like that. So our experience of time is tied in with how we exist as biological life forms. Now, something that is not biological in nature doesn't need to necessarily experience time in that fashion, and so could exist sort of outside of that. We experience time as sort of this flow. There's that cliche that the time marches on.
Hmm.
It's not time that's marching. It's us. We're moving through time. Time is a continuum, just like X, Y, and Z coordinates. It's we're in a boat and we're rowing through this ocean, and like things like precognition. I believe that's basically somebody dropping a stone in the water ahead of us,
Mm.
and we feel the ripples where we are. I know that's something, like I mentioned before. I've been reading Joe McMoneagle's book about remote viewing, and one thing that he constantly brings up is the importance of feedback and the importance of let's say you do an associative remote viewing, um, or let's just say you do a regular remote viewing of I don't know, a church or something.
Mhm.
It's important that you be shown what you were supposed to be viewing after the viewing's over, or at some point in the future. So you're given feedback. Um, in a way, I think that may be the key to what's really happening with that phenomena, in that you're not necessarily remote viewing anything. You're not necessarily having a precognitive event. What you're having is a memory of the future, if that makes sense.
Yeah, there was a guy on Skeptico who worked with Project Stargate, and that was kinda
Mhm.
his thought on what was happening as well.
Yeah, and I think that's right on the money, because I believe what's happening is that when you're given that feedback in the future, there creates this sort of entangled causal link with that event and when you were trying to view it in the future. It creates sort of a loop. There's a term that I've been looking at that I just found out about a couple days ago called quantum retrocausality. And I think that that is possibly the sort of mechanism by which this works. I don't know, I hesitate to bring up some quantum mechanical stuff because I believe that a lot of people use those terms incorrectly.
Right.
Sort of use it as an explanation for everything. When in reality, it is a scientific topic, and I'm not a physicist, so I don't want to say too much, but I will say that it makes sense to me that if quantum entanglement works over the gulf of time, that an event that happens to or information from an entangled particle in what we perceive as the future could be perceived in the past, because that entanglement, that information transfer works over time itself.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. No, that's a very good point. And we don't know how that information transfers either, which, is a big question mark because it obviously does not obey the laws that we have set out for, the speed of things to travel.
Yeah, it doesn't. And it's something that needs to be investigated more because it has a lot of implications for technologies that we could have in the future. Like
Sure.
one of the big problems that we're going to have if we ever really do go, into space is that how do we communicate
Right.
over light years of distance? It's not going to work very well if we need to send a message something four light years away and it takes 4 years to get there, 4 years
Mm-hmm.
to get your reply. Your Twitter is going to be really boring if it takes 4 years to update your timeline.
But if you
So
could entangle particles,
exactly, then that information transfer could be instantaneous because it's working outside of time.
yeah.
And I feel like a lot of paranormal stuff may already be doing that biologically, and we just don't quite understand how it works. I
Right.
always think about something Peter Carroll talked about, and I believe it was Lieber. It was Psychonaut and
Liminal, yeah.
Liminal, yeah, where he talks about how when he was in India, he came across a lot of psychic dogs
Hmm.
because
I don't
he
remember that.
believed. Yeah, it's a really evocative little thing. He doesn't talk much about it, but he sort of says that he believes that they sort of had to be. And I think about that. I think that sort of psi phenomena may have just a purely biological basis, and it may be something that is inherent in all animals. Um, at least animals with a certain level of cognition. It may be something that they do all the time, and humans may do it too. We just don't even recognize it. Maybe it's
Yeah,
something
yeah.
so subtle that we don't even really think about it half the time. How many times do people get a hunch that something bad's going to happen?
Oh, sure, sure. And look at the work that whatchamacallit over in the UK did with dogs, knowing when their owners were coming home and such.
Yeah, exactly. I think it's something that we're going to discover is completely natural and inherent in most biological entities.
And I hate to keep bringing Seth up, um, but he
Mhm.
had said that time is the amount of stuff that your brain can process at any given time.
Mm.
And when I thought about that, I thought that makes a hell of a lot of sense because when you're really busy, time flies. And when you're
Mhm.
just sitting there, time kind of drags. And it's like it is kind of like a processor speed thing. It's like as things, happen because he says time happens all at once. I mean, everything that could happen has already happened. It's
Mhm.
just how we choose to move through it. And with this limitations on the existence we have here, we can only see and process so much stuff at once.
Mhm.
Which
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and
and
I
it's
mean, oh, go ahead.
no, go ahead.
I was just going to mention it's something that I had mentioned on Aaron's show, but I remember hearing a couple radio programs that were discussing sort of different people with certain mental differences and how they experience time differently.
Oh yeah, yeah.
Like there was a case study of a young girl who experienced time too quickly. Like her reaction times were too fast, and it was like hard for her to do things. She was living in a group home because she was unable to sort of get around easily because she was moving too quickly.
Right.
And you could throw something at her and she could catch it because she experienced everything is moving like in slow motion basically. And there's another guy who was the exact opposite. he talks really slowly and does everything really slowly. But from his perspective, he's completely normal. Everyone else is like talking slowly, you know?
Yeah. Yeah, there's definitely that. There's also, when we talk about what the brain can do, there have been numerous cases of people who had like genius level IQs and no actual physical brains, where
Hmm.
it formed nothing more than a little gray matter around the stem, and it was mostly fluid, but it was never diagnosed because they seem perfectly normal. Whereas most people like that are severely disabled.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, there's so much about the human brain that we don't understand, and it. I think people really have to keep an open mind about what it's capable of, what it's capable of recovering from, and what it's capable of generating in a person. Um, what it's capable of interfacing with.
Yeah. The other thing too is when you have people who get like heart donors and stuff like that, and those people who have had the donated heart start picking up information about the donor.
Yeah, that's wild, and that I think again maybe has something to do with entanglement because those particles that make up that heart are still entangled with the particles that were formerly part of that body. And if memories have something to do with that entanglement, then you could see an information transfer occurring because that heart is now becoming entangled with the body that it's been transplanted into. Like that's what people don't understand about entanglement. Entanglement happens all the time,
Oh yeah.
all around you. Every particle you interact with, you become entangled with. This is why, like you know how the word telepathy got its origin, right?
No.
Oh, so it's referred. The word literally means like pathos at a distance, like telepathos. So when the original, I forget the name of the guy who coined it. This is all in Jeff Kripal's The Supernatural, but the idea was that when telepathy was originally being studied, it was being studied as it occurred between like family members or lovers, where they would somehow know something about the other across a distance.
Right.
So everything you do around you entangles you with things around you. That includes other people around you. So I think that one of the reasons you possibly see more psi phenomena happening between people who live together, people who are like partners, like family members, is that on a very basic level, you're simply more entangled with them on a quantum level.
Hmm. Hmm.
Um, and if there is the possibility that information transfer can occur over these entanglements, it makes sense that you would have more of these events with people that you're close to. Like I know for a fact that like my girlfriend, we constantly sort of, are thinking about the same song at the same time.
Right.
Or, we finish each other's sentences because we're always around each other. It could be a combination of things. It could just be, well, we just know each other really well.
Hmm.
And we listen to the same thing. Maybe we both heard the same thing that triggered the memory of that song or whatever.
Right.
It could also be a more subtle kind of psi phenomena happening as well, or in combination. I believe these things sort of happen in combinations with each other.
Oh yeah, absolutely. It doesn't have to be one specific thing. There's obviously
Mhm.
some bleed over from one thing to another.
Mhm.
Um, and as much the entanglement thing is likely connected to all of this, but also I think that we live in a universe that is basically just information. And so when we have things like memories, those memories are just information stored in the environment as well. It may be that they
Mhm.
stick around us when we're alive. I mean, well, to some degree, because clearly some of us have very bad memories.
Mhm.
But there's like how we form memories and how it gets put in that information field may vary as well. Like different memories may be stored in different ways. Traumatic memories may store a different way than, your everyday memories that don't, mean a whole
Mhm.
lot. But I think there's again a combination there of things happening.
Mhm.
And
You know,
go ahead.
it also ties into like biology as well. I mean, one of the reasons traumatic memories may stick around longer is because, on a basic level, maybe you survived that traumatic event, and your body sees the need to store that memory to keep you from, in case you're in that situation again.
Yeah, yeah.
You know.
Oh, it definitely could be a survival trait.
Hmm.
And I think there's a lot to, when we talk about like nature versus nurture, I think there is a little bit of everything mixed in.
Hmm. For sure. And also wonder too, like how much of what we think of as like psi phenomena is simply survival mechanisms, things that evolved. Because I mean, wouldn't an animal that has some sort of precognitive ability be way more fit for survival than something that didn't?
Right, right. And I think at a certain point though, we're not as like the way humans exist now doesn't seem to be so focused on survival.
Hmm. For sure.
Because we're so safe, it
Hmm.
doesn't seem to be a primary thing for us to worry about. So it doesn't seem to be that we react that much because there's lots of stuff we do that would completely destroy us if we were living in the wild.
Hmm. Yeah, and another sort of on the same line, I believe a lot of psi phenomena doesn't manifest, or people don't recognize it manifesting because it simply isn't that reliable and is superseded by a lot of other more useful things, or more reliable things that we can do. I mean, if you think about it, the fact that we can get on our phone and send a message to somebody halfway across the world, that's basically how people would think of telepathy being.
Yes.
So why would you learn to do this sort of unreliable, tough to learn, hard kind of meditative psi ability when you can simply send somebody a message on your iPhone? Um, in the same fashion, I wrote a bit on my blog about how I believe that sort of telepathy and like nonverbal communication in general may have been the way humans and other animals may also communicate before the development of language.
Hmm.
So, like, and what is the guy's name? I can't remember the guy. It's a book called Amazon Beaming that I think it's Petru Popescu is the guy who wrote the book, but it's about Lauren McIntyre's time with the Mayaruna tribe in the Amazon. And in the book, he describes this process that he calls beaming, in which he has these like telepathic conversations with the head shaman of this tribe. And the way I think about it is that like, that's the way people probably communicated with each other before we had language. Now, once we had language, we didn't need to communicate like that anymore
Right.
because ultimately it's not that useful a communication medium. I mean, you can't really express a complex idea through like empathic emotional sort of telepathy. It's much easier just to tell somebody how you feel. Um, and it that may also be an explanation for why children seem to exhibit a lot of psi phenomena when they're very young, but then it starts to bleed off as they get older because they don't need it anymore. They don't use it. It's like an appendix. It just it atrophies.
Well, that could be.
Um, why would you use this nonverbal communication when you could just speak to someone?
Right. No, that makes a lot of sense, really. Um, and my experience is the people that I've had the most uh like I hate using the word psychic because it gets
Hmm.
thrown around so much, but I think everyone has a little bit of that in them.
Hmm.
Um, but at the same time, like it's when I pick up stuff from people, it depends on the person.
Hmm.
I had a friend who all she had to do is think something, and I would literally hear it in my head. Sometimes I didn't even know if she said it or she thought it.
Hmm.
And every time it would kind of freak her out because sometimes I would answer what she was thinking before she said it. And I wasn't even fully aware that I was doing it. It would just happen because I'd hear it and just respond. But that's never happened with anyone else. It's like, so why
Hmm.
did that one person, and she didn't pick up things I was thinking. So why did
Hmm.
that happen like that with just her?
See, I think you would need to examine your relationship with her, like your feelings about her, like your relationship with her, like your closeness. There's all different sorts of factors I think could come into play there, and that brings up an interesting thing too, though. Something that people don't really discuss a lot when it comes to psi phenomena and precognition. and especially like what you were talking about. Um, did she really decide to say that, or was she always going to say what she said, and you just somehow knew that she was going to say it? Like, where does free will come into play there?
Okay. Okay.
Because if things like quantum retrocausality are true, it seems to say that there is no such thing as free will. It seems to say that everything that is going to happen is already going to happen. Like Seth said, everything has already happened. Everything's happening all at once. So if that's the case, do you ever really make a conscious decision to do something? Or were you always going to do that?
Well, if we live in a multiverse, and that's what Seth postulated, that
Hmm.
that every possible iteration of everything expands out infinitely.
Hmm.
In which case, in a way, both are true.
Hmm.
Because you could pick up something from the future that's going to happen, and that might be why sometimes it's wrong because you choose not to do that.
Hmm.
You know, like that information coming from the event that already happened in the future, you use to change your actions so it doesn't actually happen in your reality.
But didn't that come back around to the realm of paradox then, where the thing that you had the precognition of was never really going to happen in the first place? What
Well,
was really going to happen was what the decision that you made, and this gets
yeah,
very
yeah, yeah.
tangled very quickly.
But at the same time, you could say that it does happen. It just didn't happen in this particular timeline because everything actually happens.
Yeah, I mean that's the convenient sort of
It's
um,
just
explanation for it.
which reality are you focused on?
Hmm.
And is there another you that's just as focused on another reality?
Hmm. Yeah, it's sort of that Borgesian idea of time being a garden of forking paths.
Yeah, yeah.
Like every decision you make forks the timeline off into another direction.
And you think about that and you think, okay, well, you make decisions every few seconds. So
Hmm.
that's a lot to be forked off into different directions. But you look out into space and you look at all the stars and all the galaxies, and that for us is basically infinity. Whether it goes on infinitely or not,
Hmm.
it's infinity. We can't comprehend that. You look at what the telescopes pull in with, what was it, the Hubble that had, they were like every little dot there is a galaxy,
Hmm.
not just, a solar system, but a full galaxy, with billions of suns and so on and so forth. And you think about that, our brains can't comprehend that. Like we don't have a way of processing that. It's just too
Hmm.
much. So when we think about reality possibly being like that, it's not that far fetched because we can see right out in space is very much like that, but we
Hmm.
couldn't possibly comprehend it.
You want me to blow your mind?
Sure.
So, are you familiar with the one electron universe theory?
Yes.
Yeah, that is something I'd never heard about until like a week ago, and
Hmm.
I absolutely love it. The idea that every single electron and every single positron is the same electron.
Yep.
There's only one, and it's just constantly going back in time, and it exists everywhere. Like that is a mind blowing idea.
Yes. Oh, absolutely. I love that idea.
And that ties into the thing that we were talking about. Like is is it all one thing? Is time happening all at once? Is it not just that it's all one electron, but it's all one timeline as well?
Yeah. And going back, actually, I want to get this in
Hmm.
before we finish here. You were talking about, looking at ufology related to the occult.
Hmm.
And that was one of the things that struck me because I was studying all this occult stuff,
Hmm.
and then I started reading Strieber's stuff, and at some point I made that connection where I was like, "Wait a minute, this is the type of stuff that's happening to me, but I don't have the technological UFO sort of impression of it."
Hmm.
And as far as I could tell, no one had ever made that connection. Like, these seem to be very different fields. Like, you didn't get people practicing magic who were looking at UFOs, and you didn't get
Hmm.
people who were studying UFOs practicing magic. Now that seems to be changing.
Hmm. Well, I think people are looking at things like Crowley's contact with Lamb and things like John Dee's discussion with quote unquote angels,
Right.
and asking like, well, who were they really talking to? Who's really on the other side of the telephone? And Streeper's an interesting figure. I've talked a little bit about this, but a lot of people sort of gloss over, and he does this too. And in communion, he just casually drops that he's into like Gurdjieff,
Yes. Yeah.
and his whole, the whole part in communion where he takes the trip to Rome, and it's his like missing summer, and he has these
Yeah. Yeah.
memories and stuff. So, what a lot of people don't realize is who he was with at that time. He was with people from the Process Church,
Hmm.
and there's all this sort of occult tinge to Strieber's experiences that I feel like is always sort of glossed over. People don't really approach it from that perspective, and maybe he didn't include it because he wanted people to take communion seriously, and if he starts talking too much about that kind of stuff, people's eyes are going to glaze over.
Right. Right.
But I think that interaction between the occult and sort of the UFO world has always been there. I mean, you have people like Jack Parsons and the Babylon
Yeah.
workings and things like that. Like that sort of tie-in between those two worlds has always sort of lurked under the surface, and people just now are starting to talk explicitly about it.
Which is good because there's
Mhm.
some very obvious connections there that need to be explored more.
Mhm. For sure,
Um,
and it's something that I think is an avenue that is rife for both experimentation and for exploration.
well, that's the other thing. It gives you a direct way of at least trying to contact this stuff.
Mhm. I mean, that's the thing I always tell people about magic in general. Like, if you don't believe in magic, I don't know, try it. You have
Yeah.
nothing to lose.
Well, that's it. And that's how I felt. I didn't believe that
Mhm.
this stuff worked, and then I tried it and went, "Huh, it does
Yeah,
work."
either it doesn't work and it just confirms everything you believed, or it works and the world has certainly suddenly gotten a lot stranger.
Um, John Anthony West was also into I can never say his name right. What is it? Nope, I'm not even gonna get close
Hey,
now.
Gurdjieff?
Thank you. Sounds like handkerchief. That's what I should remember. But yeah, John Anthony West was very much into that too. I mean, not that he did UFOs, but I mean, all his work on ancient civilizations is there.
Mhm.
Um, so
It's
that's
something that I definitely wanna read more into. I'm not that familiar with it myself. Most of my experiences just come from, reading, uh, Wikipedia articles and seeing it mentioned in Strieber's work, but it's something that I need to explore more because it seems like something that heavily influenced the way Strieber both sees the world and interacts with the entities that he encounters. So,
the the other thing is, of course, the question that all this always comes down to is, are we interacting with something other than ourself? And how would we know?
I believe we are. Now, I make that statement on belief because I don't have proof for it, obviously. Like a certain other podcast likes to say a lot. I don't have anything in my garage that I'm studying. Um, I don't necessarily believe that it's all psychological in nature. I believe some of it may be, but I do believe in the existence of what you probably could refer to as like a spirit world, and that there are many entities, many intelligences that exist outside of what we are and that can interact with us. And I don't necessarily think it's all one sort of entity trying to contact us, um, because I believe people have been contacting a myriad ecosystem of entities all the way back into antiquity. Um, I do believe that sort of the UFO contact experience is a specific sort of mimetic contact from some class of entity that needs to construct a sort of image out of humanity's sort of cultural memory and mimetic ecosystem in order to communicate with us.
Hmm.
And I'm not sure why that is. Maybe they exist in some fashion or form that has no sort of relative context for the way we exist. Um, and maybe that's why they sort of always appear wrapped in the cultural memes of the time period that they appear in.
Yeah.
It's something that I'm really interested and fascinated in. You know, I don't have all the answers for it, but I certainly have ideas.
And I wasn't saying that it was all psychological so much as we may be projecting something out there. You know, look at
Yeah.
poltergeist phenomena. You know, there's, I think at least many of the poltergeist cases who fit a certain pattern are spontaneous PK that seem to have their own personalities, but they're not controlled at all by the person that's coming from.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, the poltergeist phenomenon is interesting because, you know, I recently did some work myself that involved my residents becoming infested with a poltergeist for like a week or so. And it seems like an interesting sort of side effect of either other phenomena manifesting or some sort of like you mentioned spontaneous PK emanating from someone in that area. Like I hear a lot of, you know, since I sort of have a broad interest in a lot of things, like both like, you know, cryptid related, UFO related, and the occult, I always hear people talking about the same thing. Um, like I'll listen to a Bigfoot podcast and I'll hear somebody talk about, oh well, we got rocks thrown at us in the woods, and they were warm to the touch, and there were knocks on trees and whispers in the woods. And I'm like, well, you know, if that was happening in a house, you would say it was ghosts.
Right. Well, that's where Josh had coined the term wilderness poltergeist.
Yeah, I love that term. It's a fantastic term. You know, and that's sort of, yeah, I mean, I think you're on the money there. That sort of phenomena is probably generated from an individual, as so like you mentioned, spontaneous PK, and that it may happen sort of as a side effect. It's almost like I get the idea. It's almost like a psychic cold. You know, something that I've been working on a little bit is this whole idea that things like poltergeist phenomena and just Fortean phenomena in general sort of exists in some fashion as like a mimetic virus, in that it seems to like infect people and move around from person to person. One interesting sort of tie into that was, we mentioned before, that documentary, The Nightmare. The one guy talked about how he never had an out of body experience, never had a sleep paralysis experience until his girlfriend told him about them.
Yes. I was fascinated by that because it seemed like he literally caught it from her.
Mm-hmm. And so many times I'll hear stories about, well, I was out in the woods and I saw a Bigfoot, and then I go home, and while they've been harassing my house, you know, I get knocks on my walls in the middle of the night and things thrown at my house. And it makes me wonder, like, did you catch a Bigfoot? You know,
in a matter of speaking, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you know, maybe I've even went so far as to say that in some ways, maybe entities or the phenomenon in general manipulates this aspect in order to spread itself, because it almost exhibits sort of the same like characteristics of a virus, in that, you know, like we're doing right now, we're having a show where we're talking about experiences, and people are going to listen to the show, and the memes that we're discussing are going to continue to propagate through the human cultural ecosystem.
Yeah.
And that always made me think about, there's a part in Kripal's The Supernatural where he talks about the U.S. military's or sort of real reason for, you know, not disclosing things or trying to cover up things, in that it's the belief in these things that's dangerous. Not that they actually exist, but that the belief in them gives them some sort of way in, you know?
Yeah.
And what if that was really it? What if that was the reason the cover-ups and everything else, if they exist, happen, is because they may see it as some sort of mental infection that spreads from person to person through ideas and experiences.
That's a fantastic way of looking at it. Huh. And it doesn't make it bad either. That's the other thing.
Mhm. Yeah, I
I
mean,
mean,
it could be like so many people like Valet have mentioned that it seems to be the whole experience, phenomena writ large, seems to be a sort of control system or a sort of way of engineering the way people think or interact with the world or engineering like human society. I mean, maybe that's true. Maybe it is moving us because so many times when people come into contact with these entities, they have channeled experiences. It completely changes them. You know,
yeah.
they
Oh,
be- they
absolutely.
become they become more empathic. They become more spiritual. Um, Sometimes it's a good thing. Sometimes it causes people to become obsessed and it destroys their lives.
Right,
So,
right. And you see the sort of the better aspect of that with people who have near-death experiences most of the time, because they have a lot of the
mhm,
same after effects. It usually doesn't destroy their life. I mean,
mhm,
once they recover from whatever happened to them, they usually find themselves in a better place.
mhm.
So
Yeah, and
that's
maybe that sort of those experiences self-propagate and like certain human like physical worldly viruses and other sort of parasites and stuff actually modify host behavior in order to spread and propagate.
hmm,
So
yeah,
what if sort of the contact experience, if we want to take a different view of this, maybe it's not a spirit world, maybe it's something else, maybe it's a sort of parasite of culture, like a
hmm,
parasite of a of I guess the ecosphere of the mind, and it modifies host behavior when someone's infected with it. It makes them more spiritual. It makes them more willing to spread their ideas, and then um, sort of infect other people with the meme.
that's really interesting. I've never thought about it like that.
What if what we're dealing with is like I said before, a mimetic virus?
Hmm. Um, Now you said you had some poltergeist activity after something you did. What was the deal with that? I know you talked about it on Aaron's show.
Yeah, I during the solstice, I decided to do what's referred to as the headless rite. And after that, I performed the invocation of the four kings. And after that invocation, I had an experience where one of the entities involved with that, I believe I had a contact experience with them, in which I asked them for assistance and sort of had a classic, I don't know, Solomonic type summoning experience. It's kind of the first time it ever actually successfully happened with me. So it caught me off guard. And even now, I don't entirely know if it was just all in my head or if it really happened. It seems it's almost dreamlike when I think about it.
Hmm.
And and afterwards that night, um, I had an experience where I was like kind of cleaning up. Like I have my office in my lower kind of basement area, and I'd been doing the ritual there, and I heard someone walking around upstairs. And my girlfriend was out of town. The only other person in the house is my dog, and my dog has three legs, so it has a very noticeable sort of hop that it does when it hops around. It wasn't a hop; it was like footsteps, like someone was walking around upstairs. I got really worried because I was like, "Did I forget to lock the front door? Is someone in my house?" So I went upstairs, and sure enough, there was nobody up there. My dog was asleep um, on the bed where I'd left it when I went downstairs. And over the course of the next couple of days, I would sort of hear weird noises, knocks. Would occasionally think that I heard like out of the corner of my ear, like someone whisper something or like a laughter or something. When I talked to Aaron about it, he had told me that that was a good sign that if you had done a ritual or something like that or tried to contact an entity, that uh, that's how you know it worked.
Right, right.
you know, accidentally haunting your house is just part of the game. So,
Hmm.
but
I,
it's
I
it's it's died down since then. I haven't. It's been pretty like a month or so since I did the ritual, and then everything's back to normal now.
I just get random poltergeist stuff just out of the blue, and it's like, okay, that was interesting. The one that's been bothering me recently has been
Mhm.
my fire alarms going off at random. Luckily, there's never been any sign of anything being on fire, but it's,
Hmm.
they'll beep once or twice. And it's not like the same alarm. One's wired into the house, the other one's on a
Hmm.
battery, and it's just like, why do you keep going off? And it's like, there's nothing, there's no smell of smoke. It's like, why? This is like, is something trying to warn me of something, or is this just something playing with us?
That's exactly what I thought. I thought it was just something maybe playing with me because I'm like, well, the entity I summoned was a king, and he has to have a court. So maybe some of his courtly subjects decided to stick around and mess with me for a little while. Um, but yeah, I mean, it's one of those things where it's like you mentioned, it's just like little things here and there, like something will fall off a shelf or you'll hear a knock on the wall. But it's almost infuriating because you want to be like, you can just come out and talk to me, like I'm here.
Right, right.
Yeah,
Yeah, you want a more direct contact, but it's not giving you that.
exactly. Maybe that's the point.
Um, there was, oh crap, what was I just going to say? Oh, when I had finally decided I was going to write a book about my experiences, every single night when I went to sleep, I would hear someone walk into my room and stand over my bed, like to the side of the bed.
Hmm.
And the first couple times I thought it was my girlfriend, and I was like, "What?"
Hmm.
And I was like, because that didn't seem like a normal thing she would do,
Hmm.
but it made sense. And then I turned on the light, and of course there was no one there.
Hmm.
But I mean, it was a very distinct footsteps that would come into the room, and I was like, "What? Why is this?" And then finally I said, "Okay, there are certain parts I'm not going to write about," and then it stopped.
Hmm. So it's interesting. So you never really got to look at it. You never really could
No,
tell what was there.
nope.
That's interesting. My little brother has been telling me how during all of his out of body experiences, he's been encountering this woman, the same woman every time,
Hmm.
who won't tell him who she is. When he asked, he said she told him that you know who I am,
Huh.
and I think that sort of reoccurring contact experience is really interesting. Like I've had a similar sort of experience where something came and stood next to my bed when I was really young. During a particularly bad sleep paralysis episode, I saw my door open to my bedroom, and sort of a little being, just like a shadow. I couldn't catch any features, but it moved sort of like a marionette on strings, sort of this jangly hopping motion. It sort of walked next to my bed and stood next there. And when I broke out of the sort of sleep paralysis, it disappeared. It was gone. But so you didn't have any sleep paralysis or anything with the person walking into your room. You just sort of just felt them
Oh
enter
yeah,
the room and
I was wide awake.
hmm.
Like I had just laid down. It's like I would lay down, turn the light off, and then I would hear footsteps come into the room and be like, what, like what is going on?
But see, would you want to actually see it though?
Sure.
What would you do if you turned on the light and something really was there?
I think it depends what it was. I'm used to, like, if it's just a shadowy figure, that's
Hmm.
par for the course for me.
Hmm.
I'd be more worried about it being an actual person.
Yeah, yeah, really. I mean, that's the actual real fear, right? Because something like a shadow person or some sort of entity, you could just make
Prob-
it go away.
right,
But if
right,
it's a real
exactly.
person in your room, things get a lot different and a lot scarier.
Someone has, broken into my house and, oh, this is real physical danger.
Hmm.
And whereas some people will say, well, having a spirit in your room is real physical danger, I've never had that. With all the spirit interactions I've had, I've never had anything really give me cause for major concern.
Hmm. Yeah, some of your experiences are super interesting. I've listened to the show for a while, and I always think about the tree shaking,
Yeah, that was
and
definitely one of the weirdest.
it always reminds me. I've listened to a couple like sort of Bigfoot podcasts where they talked about seeing a Bigfoot or a cryptid in the woods just standing there and shaking a tree at them, like
Hmm.
not
Hmm.
approaching them, just shaking the tree. And it always makes me think about you talking about the tree shaking, even though you didn't see a
Anything.
creature. Yeah, and didn't your friend like not see the tree shake at all?
Yes.
That's so wild.
And the funny thing is, like, my memory of it was that switched which friend didn't see it. Because the one who didn't see it was also the one that experienced a lot of other stuff with me.
Hmm.
So it made sense in my memory that he would have been the one that saw it and the other person would have been the one that didn't, but that's not what happened.
Yeah, it's sort of the memories around these sort of experiences always sort of fascinate me because they always seem to get jumbled, or
Well,
when you
that
get that
had
Oz effect.
that happened. There was no Oz effect at that point either.
Mm-hmm.
And it also happened. I mean, this was like 1992 or something like
Mm-hmm.
that. So it was a while back, and I had the memory down, exactly how I read once I went and read it. Let me try and
Mm-hmm.
talk here. Um, I looked at it and I had everything right, except I had switched the two people, the one who saw it and the one who didn't see it. And I think again, that's because I assumed he must have seen it because he saw all this other stuff.
Mm-hmm.
At some point I had asked him, do you remember when this weird thing happened? And he went, yeah, but that's not the weirdest thing I experienced with you. And I'm just like, okay, yes, I know, but that's the one I didn't write down. And I just wanted to make sure you remembered it the same.
Yeah, like when I think back to, I know one of the experiences I wrote about in my blog was when I sort of saw what I've only been able to describe as living geometry in the woods. When I think back to that experience, it's almost like a memory that someone else had. It's like, I don't know if it was because it was so horrifying that it almost seems like a dream now.
So what happened?
Well, I was hiking in the woods with my dad and my little brother, and I like to sort of I don't know, when I was a little kid, I always like to sort of scout ahead and walk by myself. So I walked probably 15 minutes ahead of them. Um, and I rounded a bend, and in the path there were these two very large birds. I think they were just like turkey vultures or something, and they took off. Kind of startled me. They flew over my head, and I started hearing this kind of metallic clinking noise coming from down in like the hollow below me. And I walked forward a little bit and looked down into the hollow. And I mean, this is where the memory gets weird because it's like all I can really remember, and the only way I can really describe it is I saw like what looked like a polygonal quadrupedal animal,
Hmm.
like almost like a tiger made out of like polygons or something, like just triangles and geometry. It was like black and white, like almost like stripes or something, and it was just moving around, like walking around down inside the hollow, and it scared me immensely.
I'm sure.
Like I just started running. I didn't, I'd seen enough horror movies as a child to know that you don't stick around, like you just get out of there. So even though I didn't know what this thing was, and now I wish I'd stayed a little longer and maybe viewed it, got a better look at it because it's so weird when I think about what it looked like. I just ran back to my dad and my little brother, and they have, of course, laughed at me, and said that I'd gotten scared because of some turkey vultures and didn't believe me at all. And we walked back to where I'd been, and there was nothing there when we all were there. So to this day, I don't know what I saw, but when I think about that memory, it almost seems like a memory from someone else. It's like dreamlike when I think about it because I can't honestly put into words what the thing I saw looked like. It was almost like it was like Lovecraftian, like it was something that I couldn't comprehend.
Huh.
And I don't know, I've never heard anyone else describe anything like that. I'd been talking to Adam Olson on Twitter, and he had said that one of his friends had seen something similar, sort of like living geometry. And it sort of reminds me of things like people would describe seeing when on, DMT or mushrooms or something.
Yeah.
It's sort of like living geometry, living shapes and colors. But I was completely sober. I was like 11 years old. So
Maybe you well, either maybe you had some spontaneous, like endogenous or whatever it's called.
mhm,
I think I just used the wrong word, but DMT,
mhm.
or maybe you were seeing something that your brain didn't quite know how to camouflage.
Yeah, that's it's either thing's possible, or it's just possible that it was something completely mundane, and for some reason, as a child, I got so scared that I imagined it as something else. Like we mentioned, memory's a fallible thing, but when I remember it, when I remember the event, I clearly see sort of these shapes, triangles moving around in the bottom of that hollow, and sort of that metallic noise. It almost sort of reminds me a bit in Ingo Swann's Penetration. There's a part where he talks about being taken to this place in sort of the northwest, where he sees a UFO materialize, and he describes it as materializing sort of out of like geometric shapes. Like it starts as like a small like sort of triangle and sort of grows out of that into the ship. Um, and I guess that's maybe the only thing that I've ever read that even slightly resembles what I saw. But who knows? I sometimes wish I had stuck around a little bit longer so I could get a better look at it. But I'll never know now.
Well, maybe someday all answers will be available.
Hopefully.
All right. Well, where can people find you online?
So, maybe one of the best places to find me is either my blog at liminalroom.com.
Okay.
Or I'm pretty active on Twitter. I'm at Mr_Apol, APOL, just like from the Mothman Prophecies.
Right.
I talk a lot on there, usually either about game design, socialism, or UFOs. So if you're interested in any three of those things, I've got you. I've got you covered. And there's a lot of other people on Twitter as well, like Tim Banal, Josh Cutchin, Aaron David, and stuff. Then we kind of all talk together. So if you want to get involved in those conversations, you can find me again at Mr_Apol. Nice.
All right. Well, thank you for spending some time with us.
Thank you. It's an honor to be on your show. I mean, been a long time listener, and I'd love to have conversations about this kind of thing with anyone.